Hello, and welcome to another edition of Crapper with myself, Tim Appleton, all on my Todd today. I shall be looking during this brief episode at 10cc by 10cc. That's to say, the first album by 10cc, released in 1973. Strawberry Studios, Stockport, just outside the city of Manchester, was the venue for the recording, and it was on the released on the UK label, run by the pop impresario Jonathan King, who was also an early patron of Genesis because he went to the same school as them. And I should say, I think this is one of the greatest UK rock albums of the 70s. By one of the greatest, for my money, the greatest UK rock bands of the 70s, 10cc. Now, it might seem strange to say that. Does it seem strange to say that? Maybe it does, because they were extremely popular at the time, 10cc, with a certain quite large swathe of the public. But since that period, the 70s period, they've been slightly sort of, I would say, erased from rock history. They didn't seem to be very well remembered by their colleagues, in the union, the rock music union syndicate. And I don't know whether that's affected their sort of the retroactive, appraisals of them. But I mean, I always think it's a bit like, like one of those photos of the Politburo under Stalin, when Stalin was running the Soviet Union, and they had those early photos of the Politburo with like people's faces like blanked out. We've got a sort of Stalinist version of the history of rock here, with 10cc being kind of like blacked out of the picture. But yeah, I love them, and I'm going to try to transmit a bit of that love in this episode. I think that, how could one describe them? I think that they're a little bit. They bear a family resemblance, to use the Wittgensteinian term, to Queen, perhaps. I think actually Graham Gouldman once said we could have been like Queen, but we never had a Freddie Mercury figure. Also, but I think that gives you an idea as to the style. But also, Queen were a touring band, which 10cc weren't really. They did some gigs, but they weren't. It was sort of studio nerds, really. So they spent more time like just making their albums, which, if you're an album fan like me, is great news. But sorry, ignore the dog. For sort of raising the band's profile, it's probably not quite as good. I think it's slightly Frank Zappa-esque as well, the dimension of pastiche, sense of humour, although their sense of humour is slightly different to Frank Zappa's, which is more cynical, and more sort of, scattershot satirical, perhaps. And maybe also another like British comparison would be the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band. It was sort of slightly earlier than 10cc, but they also did the pastiche thing. I think 10cc were better songwriters. No offense, because I do love the Bonzo Dog Band, but I think 10cc kind of bottles the humour, but also the best of Bonzo songwriting, and turned it into a formula. But who were 10cc? Well, they emerged as a sort of out of a series of studio projects, precisely in Strawberry Studios, right? Which I think Eric Stewart, formerly of the Mindbenders, was the boss of. And they sort of played with lots of different artists and things, did some of their own work. None of it really broke through. They sort of tried to write some hits, but none of them really made much of a dent in the public consciousness. Graham Gouldman, one member of 10cc, we've got Eric Stewart, Graham Gouldman, Lol Cream, and Kevin Godley. They're the four original members. Graham Gouldman had already been a sort of almost like a brill building songwriter for a while in the '60s, and he wrote some classic pop hits for the Hollies um, and Herman's Hermits, things like that. Um, he proved himself to be a sort of like potentially like an epic songwriter. He proved his reputation already. But he sort of came perhaps to this sort of Strawberry Studio project vibe a little bit later on, I think. And the others had tried various bits and pieces, but hadn't really managed to, as I say, managed to break through. They then they released one single called Neanderthal Man, which was a big hit. I think it might have been number one in the UK. And that was a sort of studio jam, really, but they turned it into a track. And they released that under the name Hot Legs. That was the name of the band. And then they did an album, which I think was called Think School Stinks, and was then later reissued as You Didn't Like It Because You Didn't Think of It. But I don't think that, I think that also didn't really make much of a dent in the public consciousness. And then at a certain point, they decided to try something new, I think. And they had two songs, one written by Gouldman and Stewart, which was sort of, because they generally wrote in teams of two, right? So Gouldman and Stewart on the one hand and Godley and Cream on the other. Gouldman and Stewart wrote a track called Waterfall, which is a great track, great rock track. And Godley and Cream wrote Donna, and which is a sort of pastiche. And so they had, I think they could have gone one of two ways, sort of straight head rock or kind of like humorous pastiche type music. Very well written, but still sort of pastiche-y, if that's a word. And in the end, they decided that they were going to release this single Donna under the new name of 10cc, right? And I suppose Waterfall got relegated to, I think, the B-side of Donna, actually. But I suppose later on they kind of synthesised these two things a little bit. The pastiche thing kind of like it faded away a little bit when Godley and Cream left, and they went more sort of a little bit more mainstream rock under the in the Gouldman Stewart period, because Gouldman Stewart carried on the band in 1977 when Godley and Cream left, right? So anyway, they reached this turning point. They created 10cc, and they put out a couple of singles, 2-3 singles maybe, and then they put this album together. A couple of the singles were big hits. One of them wasn't so much, but we'll come back to that. It's a sort. I think this album 10cc is near perfect. It's as close to perfect as any rock album really can get. Some people prefer the second album, Sheet Music, because they did 4 albums as a 4-piece, and it was 10cc, Sheet Music, the original soundtrack, and How Dare You. And then Gouldman Stewart carried on the band for a while, did a few more albums, and then they kind of took a break. But some people prefer Sheet Music, perhaps, the connoisseurs, and I think Sheet Music is amazing. I mean, all of the first 4 albums I think are totally amazing, and the first post-Godley and Cream album, Deceptive Bends, I think is also pretty great. I think they slightly went, for my money, they went slightly downhill after that point, or became slightly less interesting. But this first album, as I say, is near perfect. In some ways, I prefer Sheet Music, but I think that this is so iconic, this album, and so original, and so surprising that I think you've got to really give it the kudos that it deserves. There's a John Peel quote, who was like a BBC Radio 1 DJ, on the back saying, "I'd love to hear a 10cc album." And that's a very curious quote, enigmatic. But I think what it's to do with is the idea that I think Peel had probably heard some 10cc singles and thought, right, now what would an album by this band sound like? And so they used that as the sort of emblem for the album. Now here is the album that John Peel was speculating about. And yeah, what an album it is. I sometimes think it's like listening to a greatest hits album. Not because it's got their greatest hits on it, all of their hit songs on it, but because every song is like it sort of invents its own sound world and is really original and exciting and brilliant. Maybe possibly with one exception, but we'll come back to that. And so it's a real kind of treat of an album. This. I think the other thing perhaps to say is that I think the lyrics are great. There's a really great lyrics, the sort of best lyrics really that 10cc did. I think they lost their nerve a little bit later on, but all of the jokes land on this album, I think, and all of the poetry works. You know, the the poetry of the lyric writing works. You know, it is very comedic and very funny. I mean, the thing about jokes is that they have to be funny, I think, in order to work. And I think perhaps as they went on, that changed because the jokes became less funny. They kept doing jokes, but they became less funny later on. They became sort of perhaps more sardonic, let's say. You know, I definitely think these lyrics are less sardonic and probably funnier than Frank Zappa's lyrics. It's also I think that has an effect on the album, the comedic dimension, because it's very joyful, this album. I think it's one of the most joyful albums that they did, you know, not just because of the jokes, but also because they're pastiching a form of music which you know, is kind of Americana, teen Americana, which is very full of sort of energy and joy anyway, plus the occasional tragedy, you know, the occasional motorbike accident or whatever it is, which is played here for comedy a couple of times. It's a cool cover. I tried to research it a bit, the actual album cover, but I couldn't really find anything out. I wondered whether it was designed by Godley and Cream because they were art students. It's quite an iconic cover with this is white background, 10cc in spelt out in inner tubes, bicycle inner tubes, but with loads of like patches on them because they've burst a leak, you know, which is kind of funny and cool, I think. So it kind of sets the tone, I think. But as I say, I don't really know much more about it than that. Let's get into the tracks, as is our wont. Now, the first track is Johnny Don't Do It. Now, this was, I think this is a strange opener. This is the only track on the album that doesn't quite convince me. You know, after this, it's all gravy. But this is the one that I feel slightly ambivalent about. It opens with a fanfare, dun, 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 played slightly out of tune, for comedic effects, I think. So this is the sort of like the please please me moment. You know, I saw her standing there, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the career starts. You know, so it's a career opening synth fanfare here. And this is a slow 6/8 doo-wop pastiche, right? Hence the voice. Lol Cream singing this one, I think. Lol Cream does some great vocals throughout this album. Later on, he seemed to give up singing, but at the beginning, he seemed like to be the main singer in 10cc. And they've all got great voices, actually, but Lol Cream's is outstandingly good. And here he's doing this beautiful sort of falsetto, right? Now, I mentioned earlier that some of their songs were big hits in the UK. I think this was the first song to come out was Donna, which reached number 2 in the UK charts. Johnny Don't Do It was their second single, and it didn't chart, actually. And I think that's not an accident, because it's a sort of like, it's a repeat of Donna, same time signature, same sort of mood. But I think it's not quite as interesting a song, this one, right? And it's not quite clear what the comedic function of the voice is here, right? The programmatic function. And I think basically what they're doing here is they're trying to take off the Shangri-Las, the leader of the pack, because this song is about a guy who buys a motorbike. I think the Johnny Don't Do It is about, like, don't buy a motorbike, because when he buys a motorbike, he dies, right? But that's not really a very particularly interesting story. There's no real punchline there, right? The leader of the pack is more elaborate. I mean, the leader of the pack is actually a better track than this. That's the thing. So I think if you're going to do a pastiche of that kind of music, it's got to be either funnier or more satirical, or it's got to be a better tune. But I think that this is none of those things, so it's not a surprise that it bombed. Why did they put it as the opener? Well, who knows? I mean, maybe it was because of that opening fanfare. Maybe they just wanted to get it out of the way. I don't know. I mean, ultimately, I sometimes wonder whether the fact that there's no sort of tragic tension in the story of this song is that perhaps that's what the joke is. I don't know, but if it is, I just don't get it. By the way, talking about this being the opening track, I actually had a copy of this album that I inherited from my dad, and I couldn't read the label, so I couldn't work out. Because the UK labels were sort of weird and difficult to read. So I couldn't work out which side was A and which side was B. So I always played side 2 of this album as side 1. In some ways, it works better like that. Partly because you don't start with Johnny Don't Do It. But anyway, you might want to try that if you're a 10cc fan, like listening to it the other way round and see whether you prefer it. I've always felt that Speed Kills, which is the first track on side 2, is like the opening track, really. And I don't appreciate Johnny Don't Do It so much as an opener. But anyway, there we are. I think I've slagged it off enough. Now, let's go to track 2, side 1, Sand in My Face, which is awesome. And for me, this is where the album really starts to pick up, right? This is hilarious, this track. It's hilarious, but not sarcastic. It's just absurdist, really, right? It's got this. It's a story of a guy who goes to the beach and feels ashamed because he's not very muscular, and there's another guy called Alex who's getting all the girls because he's got bigger muscles, right? Which is kind of hilarious idea, and then the protagonist does the Charles Atlas bodybuilding course, and then he gets the girl, right? And that's the denouement, and that's just it sounds simple, but it works so well the way that they put it across, and it's so absurd, the whole thing, really, the whole story and all the phrasings. It also got a really cool riff, this one, da 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 dum, ba da da dum, da 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 da. And so it sets up a nice sort of like vibe on this track. It's a cool opening. And then they do something in the middle, which they do in a lot of these songs, which makes them, it becomes a feature in these songs, which is that they go into very beautiful sort of church-like middle section. I think sung by Kevin Godley on this occasion, because Kevin Godley's also got an amazing falsetto and an amazing voice. He's sort of alternating here a bit with Lowell Cream. Later on, Eric Stewart became more of like the lead singer, I think, and not just after Godley and Cream left, but like even on the third album. And yeah, so I think these Mr. Atlas, won't you bring her on back to me? I lost my girl down by the beach. She's with Alex and she's out of reach. Alex, whoever Alex is, and it's just a beautiful middle, that really rich, harmonically rich, and then it kind of makes the opening and closing sections, the rocky sections, much more interesting. They're interesting in themselves, but their interest is amplified by this sort of beautiful middle section. My only complaint with this track is that the refrain, dynamic tension, is sung slightly out of tune by someone. Some bugger in there is singing out of tune. And I find it slightly jarring, but okay, whatever. He's all's fair in love and war, whatever that means. Okay, track 3 is Donna. Again, as I said, this was a big hit for them. Their first sort of major track, reached number 2 in the UK charts. It's a bit weird that it's so close to Johnny Don't Do It on the album. Again, the programming question comes up here, but because it's in exactly the same time signature and with exactly the same mood, and it's again a doo-wop song. It's actually a variation, this one, on "Oh Darling" by the Beatles off Abbey Road, but I think this is better than the Beatles song, right? And I mean, maybe that's why they got the clue that we could actually do this. This could actually work, because they realised that they were sort of doing in a Beatles idiom, but they were actually taking like a Beatles style and making it sort of more interesting in a sense, right? That's not always easy to do because most Beatles songs are incredibly interesting in themselves, but on this occasion, I think they've managed to sort of elevate the tune and the song, right? Um, this has got again another beautiful low cream falsetto, and he's singing in a girl's voice, but it's sung for a girl, which is kind of funny. I mean, it's not politically incorrect. It was it was a different time, but I think that's the fact that there's an ambiguity there is kind of amusing, and I also like Donna. You make me stand up. You make me sit down. You make me sit down, you make me stand up. It's like, what's going on here? Are you sitting down or are you standing up? Which is it to be? So that kind of absurdist humour is just percolates throughout this album. Track 4, side 1, is The Dean and I. Now this is a more medley-ish number. This is the first of the more experimental numbers. They're already sort of having medley-ish elements in the first 3 tracks, but here it becomes really sort of much more sophisticated and complex, the compositional structure. It's almost sort of prog rock, this one. And probably sort of a prototype, in that sense, as a prototype for some of the more longer pieces that Godley and Cream did later on, Somewhere in Hollywood, One Night in Paris, and then Consequences, which was a triple album, like a fully integrated triple album. Might do an episode on that another day, because there's a lot to say about Consequences. But this is a really interesting track structurally, and it's filled with rich sort of jazzy guitar chords, lots of nice minor sevenths in there, and again we've got a sort of soft falsetto interlude in the middle. Which is extremely harmonically and melodically rich. I mean, there's a bit, talking about the melody, there's a bit, elevator in my heart, it's gone AWOL, 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 AWOL. So they're sort of incorporating a church bell sequence, because this song's about somebody marrying the daughter of the dean, right? They incorporate that in the melody, right? And there's sort of constant key changes in the middle. So I think they're sort of displaying a harmonic sophistication here, which is unusual. There's few other bands were even capable of this, It's more like you have to go to more straight prog stuff like Genesis and things like that to get these complex and constant changes of key, if not of time signature. Because 10cc tried to be a bit more groovy, I think. Perhaps that's why they had a lot of hits at the beginning. And so it's a little bit, in the sense that it's a medley, it's a little bit Queen-like again, sort of Bohemian Rhapsody. I would say that this is, Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, who recently passed away, described Good Vibrations, I think, as a pocket symphony. Well, this is a pocket symphony. The Dean and I, not just for the music, because of the music, but because they're doing this thing about the story of someone getting married and all this sort of stuff, and it's kind of like classical in its scope. This one, I wish they'd done more of this stuff, to be honest, and I really wish that Godley and Cream hadn't left the band after 4 albums, because it felt like they hadn't quite they could have done more. I think this band. Still, we should be grateful for small mercies. In this case, the 4 albums that they did bequeath us. Side 1, track 5 is Headline Hustler. Now, this is the first big Goldman Stewart number, right? And the other ones so far have sort of been like Godley and Cream, but with some Graham Gouldman contributions, I think. But this is the first sort of paradigm Goldman Stewart number. Goldman Stewart, after this album, they do 2 tracks on this album together, and they're both slightly low key. After this album, Goldman Stewart started writing the singles, the big singles, and so maybe they were still sort of slightly finding their feet at this point. But this is a great track, Headline Hustler, it reminds me of "You Are the Sunshine of My Life" by Stevie Wonder. Da 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 da. You are the sunshine of my life. The thing is that "Sunshine of My Life" is by Stevie Wonder is more harmonically dynamic, but this track, the 10cc one, is more melodically dynamic, I would say, and therefore I find this track more interesting than the Stevie Wonder song. But maybe that's a question of taste. Now, this is an anti-journalist song, right, which is perhaps very apt for today's times. And it slightly prefaces the theme of their song "Blackmail," right, which comes up later on the original soundtrack. I think the connection between 10cc and Stevie Wonder is interesting. I mean, there's a lot of there's a later track on this album, "Hospital Song," which also reminds me of Stevie Wonder a bit, sort of mid-period Stevie Wonder. It's very funky. And I mean, 10cc were a Jewish band, right? Three of the four of them were Jewish, and I always think there's a slight sympathy, socially and culturally, between like Jewish people and black people, because I guess shared history of discrimination and so forth. There seems to be an automatic identification there, and anyway, that you can see that a bit on this track, and then later on the "Hospital Song." Anyway, we'll leave that kind of speculative comment to one side, and let's move to side two. "Speed Kills" is track one. Now, I love this track. I love this track so much. It's one of the simpler tracks on the album in a sense. It's still medley-ish, so it's not simple in that sense, but the sound is much more sort of condensed here, perhaps we could say. This track really shows the power of their riffing, right? Their riffage, because one thing you forget about 10cc is how like rocky they were, you know, and how good they were at writing guitar riffs. I mean, this is they're very entertaining guitar riff writers, particularly at the beginning. First two albums filled with great riffs, guitar riffs, and distorted guitar riffs, and also the outtakes as well, and the B-sides. I mean, they all got great guitar riffs, and so also the power of their the beauty of their arrangements is what comes out on this track. It's incredibly exciting. This is funky as hell. This number. This is the sort of their first mega funky swing number, which they later sort of specialised in with tracks like "Good Morning Judge." They became sort of like emblematic of the band. It's like what it really is. It's a very fast compound time, but played with in half time on the drums. Dum 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 dum, and like the it's definitely compound, I think. But right. Yeah, and I don't know whether that made any sense. And three-part harmonies. So it's got a Crosby, Stills and Nash vibe, this one. In fact, you can imagine sort of Crosby, Stills and Nash meets Led Zeppelin. That would be this track, I think. It's based on a very short poem, this track, about someone, again, crashing a motorbike, I think. So it's sparing on the rhetoric this time, but it all works very well. Full marks, everything in its place. Now, track two, side two, is "Rubber Bullets," which was probably their biggest hit at the time. I mean, probably their third single, I would think, I guess. It was their first number one in the UK. It's still one of their most well-remembered songs. This is a sort of yes, it's in a fast sort of 6/8 swing time. It's sort of Beach Boys style, really. This one, yeah, sort of Good Vibrations kind of time signature, and it's Beach Boysy in the harmonies and the melodies as well, right, and the way that they develop, and also it's very joyful again, in the way that the Beach Boys frequently were. This is one of 10cc's only political songs, Rubber Bullets, because it's about a prison riot, of course, but done in the form of a sort of high school dance. So, I went to a party at the local county jail. So it's got heavily satirical, right? What you gonna do about it? What you gonna do? And again, it's got another beautiful contrasting sequence in the second in the middle, sung by Kevin Godley this time, doing his excellent falsetto. Sergeant Baker started talking with a bullhorn in his hand. It's all very, like, again, church-like. And, again, sort of key changes, constant key changes. The harmony writing here and the melody writing here is so inventive. I don't know how they... where they came... I don't know where all this came from. I don't know how they got so good at writing music, and I don't know why they, incidentally, why they all kind of like blew it off so quickly afterwards. But anyway, that's another story. I wanted to mention a structural ambiguity, which I find slightly jarring in this song. This is my pedantry corner. The chorus, in inverted commas, load up, load up, load up with rubber bullets, right, which is in the relative minor key. I think that structurally that actually works as a bridge more than anything else. In other words, like, all the elements you need to sort of for a song are already present in the verse sequence. So you don't actually need the chorus, right? But the chorus is great, but it only works as a contrasting section. So what that means is that when they go into the chorus again at the end of the song, it feels surplus to requirements. What they should have done, I think, is gone straight from the middle section into the load up bit again, and then gone back into the final verse sequence. They would have had to have played it a bit differently. But then it would have worked as an arch, this track, and I think that sort of structural ambiguity wouldn't have been like an issue, you know. But never mind. That's me being pedantic. Now, side 2, track 3 is the hospital song. You know, previously trailed. As I said, this is sort of like shows the influence of black music here. This is another sort of funky number. Another brilliant Lol Cream vocal again in a falsetto. For part of it, at least. This track's just got a brilliant chorus. I get off on what you give me, darling. I get off. I sang that wrong, but yeah, you get the idea. And of course, that "I get off on what you give me, darling" is a great line. It's this whole song is like a hilarious post-Freudian story about somebody who has a fetish for being ill and being mothered and being nursed, I suppose, you know. When sister brings that bedpan round, I'll piss like April showers. You know, it's again played for comedy, but it's like a comedy about, you know, psychoanalysis, basically, you know. Again, sort of Jewish connection, you know, Freud, Jewish cultural connection there. Okay, side 2, track 4. Ships don't just disappear in the night, do they? This is the second Gallman Stewart number. And like all of their very early stuff, it's got a very simple structure, right? Unlike the Godley and Cream stuff. They learn from Godley and Cream to do more complex structures later on, I think, if that doesn't sound too offensive to them. And yeah, this is a nice little number. I mean, it's a sort of rock and roll track. Again, fast 6/8, but very fast 6/8. Like, it's almost ragtime or skiffle, the vibe on this one. And again, great lyric. It's about ghosts, this one, which is funny, just funny in itself. You know, great sort of sense of the absurd. You know, don't get the shits if it touches your hand. You know, it's just great lines. Why would you write a song about being scared of ghosts? But they can't do nothing to you. They just keep walking through you. You know, so stay calm. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about ghosts. And then finally, track 5, Fresh Air from My Mama. Now, this is a partial rewrite of You Didn't Like It Because You Didn't Think of It, which was you know, a Hot Legs track. They take a fragment of it here and they turn it into a whole song, and I think they've done it. It's a judicious thing that they've done because it works better like this. This is a beautiful track and a great closer, I suppose. Although, of course, as I've mentioned before, I used to hear it as the final track on side 1. And it shows that they could already write brilliant ballads, basically, which became important later on because they did some very famous ballads, most famously I'm Not in Love, right? But this one, what I want to say about this one is it's got very poetic lyrics, right? And it's not so much of a joke this time. It's just more played for poetry. And I think it works very well. It's about somebody living in New York and like about the crime rate rising or something. But this somehow seems to reflect something about the internal life of the protagonist. So it's a nice little motif. And again, the harmonic sophistication is enormous here. I was thinking recently about how, like in the early 60s, you get songs by the Supremes, again, written by sort of brill building people. And brill building songwriters, and they have quite simple harmonic structures. They're often very good songs, but with simple harmonic structures. And then what's interesting is when you get like a Burt Bacharach type figure who comes along and makes the harmonic structure much more sophisticated, almost classical, really. And that's such an interesting thing. And I think that we're dealing with that here. 10cc have sort of Burt Bacharach levels of harmonic sophistication while still using a fairly straightforward sort of pop idiom. And I think the combination there is amazing, because what you're doing is you're taking something that's basically in a genre, but you're making it completely universal, right? By making it into something that anybody, who was being reasonably objective could find aesthetically or intellectually interesting, And I don't know, as I said before, I don't know where they get all this talent from. Obviously they're good musicians and all that, but I mean, Godley and Cream were like just plastic artists, but they obviously had the intellectual imagination and the artistic imagination to come up with really original ideas for songs and harmonic developments and things like that. And it's just so amazing, and I don't know why they don't get more credit for it, really. Anyway, that's probably a good place to stop. So thanks very much for your attention. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope I've managed to sort of transmit some of my enthusiasm for this wonderful, wonderful album. And I'll see you on the next episode of Crapper, whenever that may be. Ta-ra for now.